All right, guys, first thing I have to say about 7th period that I've noticed in the flesh is you guys are remarkably quiet. Like, oh my goodness, no one has said anything. Except for me. I've been talking the whole time, and you guys have hardly said a word. Why is that? Do you guys not know each other? Should we like play a get to know you game? Well, that's quite a few people, considering there's not very many people in here. Okay, well that's fine. So the way that I tend to teach in person is lots of times I ask questions as I'm going through and talking about things. On Zoom, that's a bit more difficult to do. So I might be asking you some review sorts of questions as we go through, and I'm not the kind that's like, absolutely raise your hand before I call on you. If you know the answer, just yell it out. Okay, before we get going with Abraham Lincoln, are there any questions about anything that we are doing, in class today? Any questions about procedure? Anything you guys want to ask me about before we get into the content? Nothing? That's what I mean. You guys are not very talkative. You're not like, oh, well, you assigned this, and why do I not have a grade yet? No questions there? Or my grade is such and such, and I want it to be such and such. Or, Mr. Cook, I want to get into Harvard, and right now your class is ruining my chances. Nothing. Okay. Okay, nothing. Sounds fine. Oh, I love it when this thing doesn't work. Guys, I'm a history teacher. I am not a technology person. And yet, what was that? I like old buildings way better. In fact, I was watching a video this morning on YouTube, maybe, about how they actually went through and physically raised Chicago by at least 6 feet, as many as 14 feet high, so that they could actually run sewage lines underneath. Because I've already mentioned to you before the situation in Chicago with the poo ditches, right? Why is there poo ditches everywhere? So because you can't have a sewer that flows. Because that's the same level as, what is that, Lake Michigan? And so they had to lift the whole city up to put sewer lines in to get flow. Because if you don't have flow, the poo doesn't go. And that's not good for your health. Okay. Yeah, anyway, very interesting. That's what I like. Technology, so-so. Yeah, you guys see this? I even have a microphone on. It's all hooked up. Cameras, all sorts of stuff. Go me. It's like a miracle. I'm just going to give you guys my thesis straightforwardly. Sometimes when I teach, especially in person, I'm like, see if you can figure out what I'm arguing. Or I might say, I'll be arguing either this or this. See if you can figure it out. But at this point, I'm just going to give you a thesis statement straightforwardly. And this might surprise you, though many thought Abraham Lincoln weak during his presidency, his political genius and his pragmatism, or to use a slightly different word, his practicality, confused his opponents, both within the United States and outside of the United States, was a winning force for the North in the American Civil War, and will help to lay the foundation for a strong federal government. So this thesis has multiple different lines of reasoning, right? You can see where I'm going, and I'm pointing this out because you guys have to have, you have to write out your thesis for your DBQs, for your essays, and you need to have lines of reasoning. Now, if I was going to be absolutely even-handed in my thesis, you could see that I would be spending a great deal of time talking about his political genius and his practicality, his pragmatism, messing with his opponents, like people maybe in his cabinet, definitely people in the Confederacy, so on and so forth. That would be one area of focus. It was a winning force for the North in the American Civil War, and I will be focusing on both of those things. And then One thing I'll be focusing on admittedly less, but if you're writing a paper, you'd want to have your third major body paragraph be this: laying the foundation for the federal government. And I'm letting you know right now that even though it's in my thesis, it's not something I'm going to be emphasizing a whole bunch in class. You guys following? So when you make a thesis, you need to be asserting something that you intend to argue. When it comes to something like a DBQ or an LEQ, what should your thesis do? So this is me asking you a question, and then you respond with noise. Yes, but specifically at the DBQ itself, there's a little there we go, acronym. AP does not stand for advanced placement, but it stands for answer prompt. That's exactly right. Okay, let's talk now a little bit about good old honest Abe. I gotta admit, breathing in this mask feels like I'm been running outside, and I haven't been. Abraham Lincoln, of course, is a Westerner. He's not born in the great state of Virginia or in Massachusetts. He's born in the Western Kentucky, and he eventually is a representative from the great state of Illinois, where, of course, Chicago is. And he initially was a part of the Whig Party. Now, I already presented the discussion before about the Mexican War. The Mexican War was a very, very important war for the United States. Definitely one of the most important, if not the most important war. Why? Someone tell me. Yes, yeah, so you really answered two things there. The first one was because we get all this, the US gets all this land. And then you tied this, at least to my argument, with the expansion of slavery, which I think is absolutely correct. Yeah, and so these are major, major things that take place here in the United States. And as a good Whig, Abraham Lincoln opposed the Mexican War. He called it Mr. Polk's War. And so if you feel that, oh, but by the way, how many of you would say that America right now is a bit polarized? You've got kind of people on one side and people on another side. If you don't know what that means, it's like, would you say that Republicans and Democrats right now are really getting along? No, so there's a tendency right now, for whatever reason, to avoid the middle and kind of go in these extreme directions. There is one direction that tends to be more conservative that says you should always praise America's actions no matter what. And so the Mexican War was good. It was the right thing to do because of America. The video you watched very much echoed that sentiment. Yes? I'm not sure that that is an appropriate position. Because guess what? And right here, maybe I'll make everyone mad at me. If there's some of you in here who are kind of liberal, you might hate me. People who are kind of conservative, you might hate me as well. Look, life and history and everything is very complex. In real life, there are almost no really easy answers. In history, even more so. Because you have people being motivated by all sorts of different things. Some of their motives are good, some of their motives are bad, some of them are selfish, some of them are, I mean, it's very complex, right? So I think that in order to appreciate history at all, we have to see that this is complex. And so some of you might be saying, Mr. Cook, you are being very negative about the United States, talking about the Mexican War the way that you're talking about the Mexican War. How dare you? If it makes you feel any better, I agree with Abraham Lincoln, right? Lincoln and me are on the same page here. We think that this Polk's War is not just. Does that kind of make sense? On the other hand, what you will not hear me say, so here's, if you're super liberal, this is going to also frustrate you. I am not going to say that because Abraham Lincoln had some attitudes that do not fit with political correctness today, he's evil and we should tear down his statue. Okay? Like, for whatever reason, there's kind of this extreme thing, and no, the truth is here more in the middle, and it's muddled, and there's no perfect motive, and there's no perfect person, and it's just complex. And so if you want to be a nuanced, and by the way, you can look around my room and you can see some of the random things that are on my walls. I actually took down quite a few of the posters that students had made over the years here recently, because today is not now is not a time for nuance. Right? Now is a time where you are judged. You're canceled. John Wayne got canceled. I don't know if you saw that a couple months ago. He got canceled. Cancel culture says John Wayne's bad. Why? Because he said some things back in the 1970s that today sound kind of racist-ish, but a little bit, like whatever. And so they're taking down his statue at the airport, and they already took down his statue at the Actors Studio. And yep, and I'm talking about renaming the airport. It's no longer going to be John Wayne Airport. It's going to be something else. Yes. So canceled. Yeah. And you know, I would also point out, like, look, you might be running around feeling all super virtuous, tearing down John Wayne's statue, but keep in mind that you would have canceled your own grandma. So down a little. My view, anyway, should be completely destroyed. I understand. I have made the comment that the greatest thing that Joe, well, maybe not the greatest thing, the most successful thing he's ever done was killing off the Me Too movement, right? Like, done. So much for that. You guys know what I'm 47 years. But if you listen to one of his speeches, he said he's been in the Senate for 180 years. So that would explain some of. Anyway, whatever. I'm not. So once again, I want to encourage you as we walk through some of this. And the reason I'm prefacing with all this kind of critique of our modern extremism is because I'm going to be sharing with you that, once again, Abraham Lincoln, whether you think he ought to have his statues torn down or he's the greatest thing since sliced bread, even Abraham Lincoln, who I tend to think of pretty highly, is complex. And so we're going to be seeing how some of his attitudes are complex and some of the things that he says are terrible. But we also will see that by the time he's in office, and then he's right before he's killed, his attitudes have changed. And I'll read you some of what he says here, and then we'll talk about kind of his position when it comes to like equality and voting and stuff. And you might say, oh gosh, turns out that people can sometimes say things and then change their mind and say something else. So let's look at some of this together. Abraham Lincoln. So we're talking right kind of about the rise of Abraham Lincoln. Who was Abraham Lincoln? Abraham Lincoln promised that he would only be in Congress for one term. People are still talking about putting term limits on Congress. People back then were talking about term limits on Congress, and Abraham Lincoln said, if you elect me, I'm only there for 2 years. He was there for 2 years, went home to Illinois, and he practiced law. He ran for the Senate against Stephen Douglas. And of course, Stephen Douglas is most famous for what? What's the concept he develops in order to make the Compromise of 1850 possible? There we go, popular sovereignty. This is Stephen Douglas's idea. This guy is a well-known quantity in the Senate. And Abraham Lincoln's running against him in a new party. It's called the Republican Party. The Whig Party has folded at this point. The Republican Party is emerging. And they have, as I mentioned before, some very interesting debates. I'm going to read you a portion of one of those debates here in just a second. But before we do, let's talk about the actual. I mentioned this to you last time, and now we're going to look at it in a little bit more detail. President Lincoln does win the presidency, but he only does so in this kind of brand new party without even having his name on the ballot in the South. He becomes president because, well, the Democratic Party splits into 2 sections. He's going up against, guess who again? Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas is a Democrat. He's in favor of popular sovereignty. But that's not good enough for a lot of the Southern Democrats who say, we don't want popular sovereignty. We want forced slavery on all things westward. And John C. Breckinridge became, so the Democratic Party splits into two, and he becomes the guy for the Southern Democrats. He also picks a very interesting vice presidential candidate. So we've talked about Polk County being named for President Polk, Benton County being named for Thomas Hart Benton, and Lane County is named for Joseph Lane. This is just random. This isn't important. But in case you're wondering, Lane County is named for Joseph Lane, the only Oregonian to ever be on a presidential ticket was here. He was a vice presidential candidate for Breckinridge, the pro-slavery candidate. What do you guys think? Go, Oregon. Okay. So, because the Democratic Party is split, Abraham Lincoln wins with like 40% of the vote. You can see the states that went for him. Many more of these states would have gone Democrat had there been one Democratic candidate. To make matters even more difficult, you had the Constitutional Union Party pulling votes, once again, away from the Democrats. If Donald Trump wanted to win this last election, the best way for him to accomplish that would have been to get Joe Biden's votes to be split between Joe Biden and who would have been a great third-party candidate to ensure Donald Trump's election. You all know his name. Very popular with some people. Bernie Sanders. How many of you know who Bernie Sanders is? Guys, Donald Trump would have smoked Joe Biden if Bernie Sanders had run as a third-party candidate. But Bernie Sanders is smart, and he knows that if he was to have run, he would have ensured whose election? And so he didn't. Otherwise, you know, does Bernie Sanders love the positions of Joe Biden? Not really, actually. No, Bernie Sanders is a lot more socialist than Joe Biden. Joe Biden's kind of like an old, really old, I mean, politician who's been there forever. You know, Donald Trump said, drain the swamp. Joe Biden is the swamp. I mean, he was there when they made it up originally. And so, yeah, so, and that's not really, you know, Bernie Sanders is like, you know, communist revolution, yay. Okay, I'm an angry old white man. Okay, anyway, so this is how Abraham Lincoln becomes elected president of the United States, with only around 40% of the vote. Oh, let me go back one really quickly here. Look at the, like, Stephen Douglas, easily of these guys on the ballot here, easily the most famous and probably the most respected. How many states does he get? He's in the blue. He gets Missouri. And yet, if you were to have a matchup between Douglas and Lincoln, Douglas would have won. But Lincoln wins, once again, because the ticket is split. He also wins, I guess, 3 votes out of New Jersey. So go Douglas. Okay. Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, and this is the straw that broke the camel's back for the southern states. They are done. And so the Deep South secedes, beginning with South Carolina in December is when it starts, and President Buchanan doesn't do anything. Okay, so before we go any further, let me point out a couple things here. So here we have the presidents of the United States, minus Obama and minus Donald Trump, and potentially here Joe Biden. If you look at these guys, historians tend to evaluate how they have done as president, and I have done the same thing through class. I'm like, yeah, George Washington, pretty good. John Adams, pretty good. Thomas Jefferson, I thought he was going to be terrible, but, you know, turns out pretty good, right? James Madison, not so good because, you know, the whole war with Britain when we didn't need it thing. And they burned down the Capitol, so that kind of stunk. Go Madison. How about, let's look at James Buchanan. There are a few presidents that tend to grovel for the very bottom of the pile in terms of goodness and quality as president, and Buchanan is one of those guys. He is fighting for the bottom with, does anyone know who else? Huh? Nope. Ford is, yeah, he's all right. Well, so Harrison died really quick, so it's hard to judge him too harshly. Like, what can you do when you have pneumonia? And then you have his grandson, who was terrible. But not as terrible as Buchanan. Okay, I guess you guys, how about anyone ever heard of Warren G. Harding? He had one of the most corrupt administrations, like the entire cabinet was stealing from the Treasury minus 2 people. And he didn't seem to realize it. He also had some other moral problems. He also made up words. Like, he would write his own speeches, and they're like, no, that's just, and then he'd go and do it, and be like, oh my gosh. Like, that's not a real word. And that one's not a real word. And that needs, okay, punctuation. He was terrible. He also had some other issues. There was the girl who was 18 or 17 who, yeah, the first ever, here's just completely random, first ever presidential scandal book called The President's Daughter. It was released in 1927, claiming that Warren G. Harding had fathered this child with this teenage girl in a Senate closet. So, yeah, that's kind of interesting. And the question, of course, for a long, long time is, was the girl really his daughter, or was this just a scandalous claim against the poor President Harding? He also had an affair with his best friend's wife for 20 years, and she later moved to Germany and became a Nazi. Good times, right? Yeah, so I mean, the presidents have some really strange personal quirks. I mean, John Kennedy, interesting guy. He had issues with women. He had an affair with many with different women. But there was the East German spy he was sleeping with for a while. That was dangerous, you know. Like, whoops, how many secrets did I accidentally give to the Soviets on that one? Then there was Lyndon Johnson, who was known for chucking his poor old hound dog across the White House lawn by its ears. Johnson was a huge guy that was very intimidating and had a very boisterous Texas personality. He was the sort of guy who, yeah, there's a story one of the Secret Servicemen tells where, you know, Johnson would go for walks around Washington in the morning, and, you know, everything was closed. And so if you drink coffee in the morning, what do you have to do? You have to pee. So what he'd do is he'd have his Secret Servicemen circle around him so he could pee anywhere in Washington, anywhere where he happened to be. And the Secret Serviceman recalls there is a story how President Johnson, so this is President Lyndon Johnson, not Andrew Johnson, who also, by the way, ranks at the very bottom of the greatest presidents of all time. This guy's terrible. I would put him at the worst, even worse than Harding, who was clueless and, you know, he had issues. And then, of course, Buchanan is down there as well. We're talking about Lyndon Johnson. Yeah, so anyway, circle around him, and the Secret Service says, Mr. President, I believe you are urinating on my leg, as he feels something warm and wet on his leg. And what's President Johnson's response? Don't worry about it, son. It's my prerogative. And he just kept right on peeing. So here's the thing about some of these presidents. Like, you know, most of us, because of our station in life, we are required to take our eccentricities and sort of like, yeah, but when you're president, you're kind of like, just whatever, like whatever. President Nixon, now, of course, he has some corruption issues, as you may be familiar with. But he was socially so awkward that he would actually practice conversations with little note cards before he had them in the Oval Office. Now, maybe some of you are that way a little bit. That's fine. He's president of the United States. And there's a story of, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was involved in Watergate later. Nixon hires him. He comes in, and Nixon has a very set way of talking with these new people that he's thinking about hiring. The guy comes in there and he says something totally off the wall. And apparently, all Nixon did was, hey, Picture.
Yeah, 20 minutes ago.
Holly, 20 minutes ago, picture. It's all right. Run fast. Go that way.
What? Yeah.
Are they related? Okay. Okay. Anyway, to make a long story short, a guy comes in, says something off the wall, and Nixon like can't handle it. He's like, and they eventually like, well, you broke him, so they took the guy out because. Yeah. So anyway, our presidents. There's some interesting ones. Here we have President Buchanan. And this is neither here nor there. I'm not making a judgment, although I do believe that the Bible says certain things about these things. Some of you probably heard that Abraham Lincoln was a homosexual. Oh, maybe you haven't heard that. Okay, yeah. Some people are like, "Well, Abraham Lincoln was a homosexual." Yeah, no, he wasn't. Like, you're just being stupid. If you think that, you don't know anything about history. Context is key here, people. Yeah, Abraham Lincoln slept in motel rooms with other dudes, but so did everyone at that time. You may not know this, but there weren't enough beds in most motels. You could check in and be like, "Here, you're going to sleep with a stranger." Now, of course, he slept with someone not of the opposite sex. That would be scandalous, right? And so you slept, if you're traveling through. And so, yeah, that happened. But it wasn't sexual. Now, not back then. Yes. Yep. They wanted to make Abraham Lincoln into a hero for the gay community. Okay, but that was just dumb. Like, just no, he wasn't. On the other hand, James Buchanan likely was. You may not know this, but James Buchanan is in all, I don't know, I wouldn't say it's 100%, but there's a very good chance that President Buchanan was gay. He is to this very day, and this doesn't mean anything in and of itself. He was our only bachelor president. He never got married. He lived in Washington as a senator before his presidency for 20 years with another dude that was his really close friend. In fact, there was one of them that was even pretty effeminate and dressed really, really well. And around, that was fast. Anyway, so this guy he lives with for 20 years, he eventually dies, and apparently Buchanan is like a broken man. It's like he's lost his friend. And the nickname around, and everyone kind of said it under their breath. It wasn't like, "Hey," It was totally quiet. But him and his friends, their nicknames were, for 20 years in Washington, Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy, which were terms that were sort of, derogatory towards someone they thought was gay. So there you go. Abraham Lincoln was not a homosexual. It's very possible that James Buchanan was. What? Okay, we're just gonna continue. Yeah, we're gonna go past that one. Okay, so what we're going to do at this point is we're going to examine Abraham Lincoln's views on some things. So once again, this is not done in order to give you a negative view of Abraham Lincoln. Now, of course, if you're one of those people that are just like uncritical and everything America ever did was the greatest thing, sure, I want to give you a negative view of Abraham Lincoln here. But it's to show you that history is complex, that people's views are complex, that they are intertwined directly with the time period in which they live, and that we need to approach these things with some degree of understanding and charity. Keep in mind that you someday too will be judged in history. Abraham Lincoln did believe that slavery was immoral, but he did not believe in equality, at least not before he was president. Now you might say, "I don't believe you, Mr. Cook. I think that that's not likely." You guys realize it's kind of a big step to go from saying, I think that slavery is bad to saying I believe in complete, total, and social and political equality. You guys realize that there's a middle ground here, right? It's not like I don't like slavery, therefore I believe in equality. Okay, there's a middle ground. And what is the middle ground? Just making sure you guys are still all good. Okay. Well, yeah, sort of. It's very complex. We'll get to that. Listen to what Abraham Lincoln says here in his debate with Douglas. And my guess is none of you have ever heard this before, and you will find it kind of discouraging and shocking. Abraham Lincoln. I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. I am not, nor have I ever been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor of allowing them to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain.
Anybody who has not had their
It's all right. So how many of you so far from what I've read are already kind of like, oh, that's messed up? Okay, continuing. Inasmuch as white and black people cannot so live together, while they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position given to the white people. I say upon this occasion, I do not perceive that because the white man is to have the superior position to the Negro, that they should be denied everything. I do not understand that because I do not want a Negro woman for a slave, I must necessarily want to marry her. My understanding is I can just leave her alone. Abraham Lincoln, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, that's terrible. How many of you are surprised Abraham Lincoln would say that? Yeah, I mean, it's kind of shocking. And so in today's cancel culture, if I was to read that and say Abraham Lincoln said that, what would they want to do with his statues? Tear them down. Pretty much. Yep, pretty much that's where we are. However, Abraham Lincoln, by the time he was killed, changed his mind. Do you believe that that is possible with people? It looked like, it was not totally clear because he died before Reconstruction really got underway. It looked pretty clear, though, that Abraham Lincoln is in favor of things like the 14th Amendment. He gets the 13th Amendment passed, and he looks like he's going to be landing pretty strongly with the let's give African Americans full rights. Today, he's known as the Great Emancipator. History's complex. You see that? Okay. Oh, how about the Civil War? Now today, when we say what caused the Civil War, the tendency is to say what? What's the one word? Slavery, right? Slavery is the cause of the Civil War. And is that basically what I've been arguing? Well, would you say that slavery is the primary key here? Yeah, slavery is. Of course, I've also been attaching it to what? Westward expansion, right? That's a major piece in understanding the cause of the Civil War. Now, let's look at what Abraham Lincoln says about his goal of dealing with slavery within the Civil War. And this is early on. He writes this in 1862, in August of 1862. So the war has been going now for a little over a year. And this is what he writes to Horace Greeley, who was very concerned with abolition. Abraham Lincoln says this: if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some slaves and leaving others alone, I would do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe what I am doing hurts the cause, and do more whenever I shall believe doing more will help the cause. I shall try to correct errors when shown to be in error, and I will adopt new views so fast as they prove to be true views. So does this sound like this great emancipator is really excited about shutting down slavery? According to Abraham Lincoln, what is the purpose of the Civil War, at least in 1862? Yeah, that's exactly right. So what about Abraham Lincoln and the Constitution? Okay. How many of you think that presidents ought to adhere to the Constitution? They ought to follow the rules and respect the different branches of government? Are you guys ready for another complicated thing here about Abraham Lincoln? Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which you can find the possibilities of the suspension in the Constitution itself. It says in Article 1, Section 9, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Now, firstly, what is the writ of habeas corpus? Does anybody know what habeas corpus means? What does the word corpus mean? It means body. Habeas corpus basically means show me the body. Now, that's the technical meaning, but there's obviously you're like, why did they put that in the Constitution? Show me the body? Like what? Okay, so the writ of habeas corpus basically means that in America, in the United States, you cannot be accused of something without and thrown into jail without actually having a case, right? Exactly. So you are guaranteed the right to a speedy trial. There has to be an accusation, and if there's no proof, well, there's no proof. So show me the body. Like, so you're accused of killing someone, and you're arrested. You're like, you can't just leave me in here forever. Show me the body. Prove to me that I killed someone. Prove this to the court. You have to show them the body to see that there is something wrong here, that I have committed a crime. Does that make sense? So let's go back and look at the text again. The writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or the public safety may require it. What was going on in 1862? Was there a rebellion going on? The South had seceded from, what else is a rebellion if not like the country declaring its like saying its independence in the middle of, yeah, that is a rebellion. Like there was a rebellion going on in the United States. And so what did Abraham Lincoln do? Suspended the writ of habeas corpus. However, there are checks and balances within our government. Who has the authority to interpret the president and the Congress's actions in regards to the Constitution? The Supreme Court. Does anyone know who that guy is there? That very unfortunate looking man. Okay, that is Roger B. Taney. He is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's also unfortunate looking. There are other pictures that are even worse. Look it up sometime. I promise you, you will freak. It makes John C. Calhoun look, nothing helps that. Have you ever heard the phrase, only a face a mother could love? I'm pretty sure John C. Calhoun's mother would be like, can I list this on Craigslist? Free to a good home. That's really, I'm sorry, that's terrible. I'm not that mean. Maybe I am, I don't know. Okay, so what happens here? The Supreme Court, they hear a case regarding Abraham Lincoln's suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, and they say, actually, you have no authority to do this. So what does Abraham Lincoln do? Does he submit to the Constitution and allow the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution? Yeah, so not only did Abraham Lincoln not listen to the Supreme Court, he continued with the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus by issuing a warrant for the arrest of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. Imagine if President Trump was like, you know what, Chief Justice John, I don't like the way you guys are ruling. I'm going to throw you in jail. I'm accusing you of it. Doesn't matter. Jail. How would that go over? Not well. In fact, Abraham Lincoln went so far as to threaten to throw the entire Supreme Court into jail. And the really humorous part of it is that you know, after this, how many? So ultimately, the Supreme Court reversed themselves, and there was no need at that point to arrest Roger B. Taney, and so he was never arrested. After this, how many times do you think the Supreme Court agreed with Abraham Lincoln? 100%. 100%. They never disagreed with Lincoln again. Whatever Lincoln said went. Does that make sense? Yeah, I guess Trump, if you want the Supreme Court to rule with you, just threaten to throw him in jail for a little while. So anyway, we walked through this to see that Abraham Lincoln's positions here are complex. Okay. Let's talk really quickly here about Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, and I think this will right now suggest a bit about his political genius. These are just some of the people in his cabinet. The people in his cabinet were almost all of them suspicious of Abraham Lincoln's abilities immediately. I mean, look at the guy. I mean, look at Abraham Lincoln here. I mean, can you take that seriously? Now, we have been sort of conditioned to look at Abraham Lincoln and be like, oh, great president. Look at the handsome man. He was so ugly that a girl wrote him a letter and said, grow a beard to cover that up. And he did. But he's still not really, he's got these big flapping ears, huge nose, warts all over to his face. And his political opponents oftentimes accused him of being a monkey. Yeah, no, that's not, his opponents called him those things. And so, and where does he come from? He comes from podunk nowhere, Illinois, out in the middle of nowhere. And he shows up, and he turns out he's like this folksy guy that's just like, hey, let me tell you a story. And you're like, how did this guy get to be president? I mean, my gosh. And that's very much how his cabinet felt about him when they first met him. So you had William Seward, by the way, who is far more famous and respected than Abraham Lincoln was during the presidential election. He was a Republican. He was better on the abolition perspective than Lincoln was, but he had too many enemies. He was from the state of New York. He had too many enemies, and so the Republican Party ultimately said, no, we're not going to pick Seward, even though everyone knows Seward. He's very well known. Let's pick a guy no one's ever heard of. He has no political enemies. He has almost no political experience. His name's Abraham Lincoln. And then Abraham Lincoln shows up, and he's like, here, let me tell you a story. You're like, oh, my gosh. And so when these people met Abraham Lincoln, they mistook him for kind of like a country bumpkin, simpleton. And in the end, they are almost all, and this is true for pretty well the entire cabinet. Salmon Chase never completely came around to really respect Lincoln, at least thoroughly. But everybody else in his cabinet went from thinking that they should be the president, and they'll just, and the thought was this: Abraham Lincoln, even from the Republican Party, he's kind of a simpleton. Seward, you can control Lincoln, right? You're Secretary of State. Just control him. It's not that hard. And there are even some rumblings today about potentially the president-elect. You guys heard the same sort of thing? Not that Joe Biden is a simpleton, but that Joe Biden's best days are like 90 years ago. I'm sorry. Is there anyone who's like a super Biden supporter? If there is, I'm sorry. I really don't mean to step on anyone's feelings here. You just kind of got to make fun of a little bit. So anyway, Seward eventually comes around to deeply respect Lincoln, but at first, this guy's ridiculous. And then Edwin Stanton, he was the only, so in case you guys don't know, if you get elected president, when you bring your cabinet in with you, you tend to pick people from your own party, yes? Like Joe Biden's not gonna get there and be like, I'm gonna put all Republicans around me. No, of course not. He's gonna throw out all the Republicans, put in Democrats, yes? And so that's exactly what's typically done. But Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, was actually a Democrat, the only Democrat on Lincoln's cabinet. And and once again, this is just to illustrate sort of how everyone tended to misjudge Lincoln, and they see the surface level guy and not recognize the genius behind it. So Edwin Stanton met Lincoln. He's like, oh, I can't work for this guy. I despise him, hate him. But because of the Civil War, the two of them were forced to work together a lot, right? I mean, clearly Secretary of War you're not going to be working with if you don't have a war very much, right? But when you have a civil war going on, obviously this is a guy you're going to be working with closely on a fairly regular basis. At the end of Lincoln's term, beginning of a second, he was shot shortly thereafter by John Wilkes Booth. Edwin Stanton went from despising Lincoln to, when Lincoln was killed, Edwin Stanton was supposedly inconsolable. He had grown to deeply respect Lincoln as the greatest president of all time. That when Lincoln was killed, Stanton locked himself apparently into his apartment and cried on and off for a week. Like, I mean, but do you see how when Lincoln works with people, their initial impressions are wrong? And by the time that they're done working with him, they have the deepest respect for the man. And he very much was that way. So once again, history is complex. Personalities are complex. Positions are complex. We'll talk more about the Civil War itself. I want to get the Civil War started, so I'm jumping back here really quickly. Let's get the Civil War started. How do you get a war started without firing the first shot? You might say, well, why does that matter? England preferred the South to the North for almost every reason, except there was one thing they didn't like. What did England like about the South? They bought a lot of cotton from the South. And when England sold industrial products, what area was the most open to buying them? The South. High tariffs, the South didn't like. The South wanted to buy industrial produced goods from England, right? And so from that perspective, it would make a great deal of sense for the English to recognize the South as a legitimate country and to even support them in the war. If that had happened, you see the difficulty? Now all of a sudden, Abraham Lincoln isn't just fighting the South, he's kind of maybe potentially fighting the British. Now, how did the British feel about Washington, D.C., the American government? Yeah, they burned it, and they burned it, let's see here, less than 50 years before this. Yeah, at this point, England wasn't our friend. England was America. See what you get, America. See that? You declared your independence from us, and now you're declaring your independence from yourself. Serves you right, you turds. Yeah, we want to support the South, but what's the one thing that they don't like? Slavery. England had abolished slavery, I think, in about 1833, something like that. So 30 years before this or so. The slavery thing was the one thing. And, you know, they could potentially overlook that if Abraham Lincoln, sends his whole army marching down in the South and starts shooting up the South. England might feel compassion for the South and then join. So the question for Lincoln is, how do you get the war started but make the South the aggressor? Any ideas? How? Well, that looks like an invasion. If what? Yeah, and the thing, yes, you're exactly right. So maybe you guys don't realize this, but the land that we're on right now, this used to be federally owned property. This was a federal fort, although we called it an army base, and then it was an Air Force base, even though it was an Air Force base without a runway. You guys realize that? Camp Adair was an Air Force base from the 50s to almost 1970, and there's not one runway on the whole place. That's kind of funny. Anyway, that's completely neither here nor there. But this was owned by the federal government. Same with a bunch of forts in the South. And by the way, that we still have federal forts all over the place in the United States. There are federal facilities that are operated and owned and run by the military branches. So, best way to get a war started is you gotta make sure the South fires on something. So rather than than Abraham Lincoln invading Fort Sumter, which was in Charleston Harbor, he simply sent a ship there to resupply it. And the South's like, you can't resupply it. We want to take it. And Abraham Lincoln's like, hey, we're not abandoning this fort. We are keeping this fort. This is the federal government's. And right there, the South is like, fine. They tried to resupply it, and the South fired on the people trying to resupply and fired on the fort, and eventually the fort surrenders after 2 days of fighting. How many people die? 0. The only thing that died was a horse. Pretty much a bloodless beginning to the bloodiest war in American history. But note what Abraham Lincoln did here. He got the thing started, he got the ball rolling, but it was the South that fired on the North first. Kind of smart. Okay, and so we'll be talking about the first Battle of Bull Run on Tuesday. We're not done with class yet, though. We still have, I'm not sure how long. Okay, 30. So go ahead, and at this point, so we're shifting gears, and people at home, we're shifting gears. So you want to make sure that you take out right now your DBQ. We're going to talk about the DBQ and what needs to be done for the DBQ. If you're at home, you'll find the DBQ was in the email that I sent you earlier at the beginning of the period. You can also find it, I believe, on the Google Classroom. So we're going to be talking right now about how to write the DBQ. We're going to review very quickly what needs to be done for the context and the thesis, and then we'll be looking at the main body paragraph and what needs to be done there. Okay, very first sentence of your paper, does it address the stuff in the prompt? Yes or no? The answer is no. It needs to be kind of broad. You just kind of introduce a general topic. Can you do so in a way that is not too broad but not too narrow? Next thing you do is something called context. 3 things need to happen in the context in order for you to get this point. 2 points possible in the first paragraph. What needs to be done? What is one of the things that need to be done in the context section in order to get the point? Somebody give me one. Something specific. Yes, something specific needs to be addressed. It needs to be the kind of the general theme, but you need to talk about something specifically. What else? Yes, absolutely. The information needs to be outside the time period listed. And what else? It needs to be relevant to the question. Right? So right now, your prompt, if you've looked at it and looked at it online at home, you'll note that it has to do with something changing between 1820 and 1860. Something has changed. What has changed during that time according to the question? Yes. America's willingness to compromise, it seemed to be there in 1820, but by 1860, something has happened. Americans no longer seem to be all that willing to compromise, right? And the question is largely, what? Yep. Why? What changed? What happened? Why did Americans at one point compromise and then later that didn't seem that they could? So that is the question. Okay. Now supposing for the context I'm like, well, you know what? Trains are cool. I like trains. You should like trains. Everyone likes trains. Maybe I'll do context about trains. I'll talk about trains and the Transcontinental Railroad. It's outside the time period. Transcontinental Railroad completed in Utah in, 1869. It's outside the time period. It's specific. What's missing there? Right? It's just not relevant. Right? You need to have something to do with what your answer to the prompt is going to be. And then, so that's what needs to be done for context. Context should be at least 2. You should do 3. 3 sentences for context, okay? 4 at most. And this is in your opening paragraph. It's the first thing that you do. It needs to be outside the time period. It needs to be relevant to the prompt. And it needs to have something specific. The thesis needs to directly answer the prompt with a line of reasoning. And what will that line of reasoning do for the rest of your paper? It will structure it, right? Whatever the first chunk of line of reasoning is in your thesis statement, that will be your first body paragraph. Okay. So what I would like you guys to do, actually, you know what? I probably should discuss the prompt with you just a tad bit more. I kind of let 5th period today have at it, and their first attempt at the thesis was kind of a disaster. So let's talk just a little bit. So if we were going to take out this language and replace it with other language based upon the time period, what is the question really asking? Like, what is the crux of the question? That's the same language. Let's back up from that. What fighting are they talking about? Yes. Yes. So to put it simply, the question is really, yep. You guys see how that's really what they're getting at here. Now that you know that that's really the question, go back, and when you write your thesis, I'm going to have each of you write a thesis statement that directly answers the prompt and has at least 2 lines of reasoning, because you should have probably at least 2 main body paragraphs in a DBQ. When you go back and you answer this, don't ignore the language of the prompt. Does that make sense? You kind of know now what it's really asking. It's really asking, like, why did the Civil War happen? Okay. Well, so they were compromising. In fact, the years that they give you really do help. In 1820, what year is, or what thing happened that really showed that they were working at compromise? 1820, big year for compromise. Yes. Yep. So in 1820, you can really start the body bulk of your essay here. In 1820, you've got the compromise known as the Missouri Compromise, right? You draw the Mason-Dixon line right here, draw it on over. Missouri comes in as a slave state. Maine comes in as a free state. There you go. Compromise is happening. And right here, because of the way that the question is worded about compromising, like they were compromising, then by 1860 they weren't compromising, it really does set you up to answer the prompt using an argument you've already heard quite a bit about. What would that argument be? Holly, you can say if you want. You're nervous to say, I know you're nervous that you're going to get it wrong, right? Yeah, right. So do you see how, and this is one of the reasons that I've given you this particular DBQ to practice with, because you're already familiar with a lot of the arguments because I've been giving you the arguments, right? You're already familiar with a lot of the facts because we've already been discussing the facts and emphasizing things. So if you're talking about, so I mean, very obviously, the question sort of begs for the answer. The reason that compromise no longer seemed possible by 1860 was because they attempted to compromise every step of the way. And by 1860, those attempts had failed, right? And if you're going to be making that argument, what's some of those really big factual pieces that would support that? Yes, and what compromise did that? Yes, but what's the name of the compromise itself? Okay, I'll just tell it to you. It's Compromise of 1850. right? So we got the Missouri Compromise. Things are going not perfectly smoothly, but compromise happens. Compromise happens. Let's talk about slavery. Nope, gag rule happens. We're not going to talk about it. Compromise, compromise. And then all of a sudden, bam, 1845, Texas shows up. Bam, Mexican War. 1848, bam, Mexican Cession. 1850, California wants to come in. And what's the concept that allowed for the Compromise of 1850 to happen? Stephen Douglas is the one who came up with that concept. What's it called? Popular sovereignty. And so, so there we go. We're still compromising. It still kind of works, right? What shows that the popular sovereignty compromise isn't working? Yep, Bleeding Kansas shows that that isn't workable. Does that kind of make sense? And so if I was to make the argument, I would go along those lines. So what I would like you guys to do is let's make an attempt at writing just the thesis statement. Now, your homework by Tuesday is I would like you to have your first paragraph done and at least start the first paragraph of the second paragraph, this first sentence of the second paragraph. Yes. So the introduction will have introduction, context, thesis, first paragraph. Second paragraph, we'll talk about here in just a minute, but be right now working on your thesis statement. See if you can hammer one out here, and we'll listen to each other's and see how we do. How are you guys doing at home? You been following along okay? So now that Abby is rejoining us, the other Abby, whatever you missed in today's lesson, the lesson is recorded and will be online, so you can go back and rewatch any piece that you've missed. Right now, I'm not sure when you got kicked out of Zoom, but we have been working right now on the DBQ, and we are working on coming up with a thesis statement, which should be a direct answer to the prompt with a line of reasoning. Can you guys hear me now? How long have you not been hearing me? Not very long? Okay. So the potential of having someone kicked out of Zoom, and since I can't see who's in here, if so Abby just got, other Abby, just got kicked out. And can you guys see who's participating and if someone gets kicked out? Okay, so if someone gets kicked out next time, just even if I'm in the middle of a lesson, just be like, hey, you know, Mr. Cook, so-and-so got kicked out, and I'll come in and let him back in. Okay, that could be useful. Okay, does anybody want to share their attempt? I see some of us are like, I'm not even ready to attempt this. Yep. Okay. Okay, yep. Okay. Well, you know what? Let's just chalk it up to a good attempt. I would love it if somebody has one that's kind of done that they'd love to share. Anybody? Okay, that answers the prompt and shows a line of reasoning. Yep. You would get a point for that. You guys see how that's the case?
Could
now,
you repeat
on the
it?
other hand, the thing that I would be concerned about is because when you get into the body paragraphs, you're going to find that westward expansion.
We can't hear you, Mr. Cook. We can't hear you.
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm using the microphone on the video, so it probably won't be quite as good at a distance, but it's the other thing isn't working quite as well right now. So we're gonna go with it. Anyway, did you guys hear why don't you read that one more time so that everyone kind of hears the answer?
Okay. Americans failed to continue to compromise due to the acquisition of new territory, the expansion of slavery, and severe sectional divides between the North and the South.
Yeah, so that answers the prompt, and you see that there are lines of reasoning there. But like I said, it could be very challenging trying to keep those conceptions separated.
Yeah, I tried to think of but I was trying.
I know it's fast. But you guys see how that is the case? You need to directly answer the prompt using some of the language of the question, and then have a line of reasoning that tells where you're going. Okay. So once again, for Tuesday, please have the opening paragraph done for class. I'm not going to have you turn it in then. I'll have you turn it in probably on Thursday. I might even have it due on Friday of next week, so that after we're in class and we kind of, talk through some of the examples, we can be more confident that we're doing it correctly. Okay, so let's now move on to the main body paragraph. You guys have already done one opening paragraph, and how did you feel you did on that? You feel you did okay? Good? You may have noted that for the vast majority of you, I gave you a grade. Some of the grades weren't really great, but I allowed you to fix that and send it back. How many of you have noticed that I did that? You just saw the grade? So so if you go into Google Classroom, if you guys look at that assignment, you can see that I have comments there that say, you didn't do this, you did this, fix it and send it back and you have full credit. Okay? People at home, same thing. If you haven't seen that yet, you can fix those and send those back for full credit. Okay, any questions about any of that? Okay, first body paragraph. What is the first sentence? So keep in mind here that I'm telling you these things very, very directly. There's no creativity here. Creativity is out.
Should be the first point of your thesis.
Yes, it should be the very first line of reasoning within your thesis. So you re-answer the prompt, but specifically with that main point that's in your thesis. Does that make sense? That's the first line. I'm going to call it a mini thesis. Okay? And then let's say that your mini thesis is something along the lines of Americans were somewhat successful early on at compromises, but this became much more difficult with the continued acquisition of territory.
And so if that was the case, I would start by introducing which compromise is being somewhat successful. Yeah, so that would be my mini thesis. I just said it to you guys, right? That's my mini thesis because it fits with what I said in my in my actual thesis. And then I would start talking about the Missouri Compromise a little bit. And I don't think any of the documents actually deal with the Missouri Compromise, do they? No. So I probably wouldn't spend a whole bunch of time on that, but then I would start moving into, and so this is all about like explaining, making an argument and explaining a historical fact. And the way that you go to do this is where some creativity is allowed. You'll know in the handout that I gave you in terms of like exactly what you need. You can do it that way, but you can also do it slightly differently. So you could say mini thesis, direct historical fact, and then explain it. Or you could say mini thesis, kind of explain what fact, the concept behind the fact, and then use the historical fact. Either of those two methods are fine. Are you kind of following a little bit? Okay. So you obviously want to use some of those historical facts found in the documents narrative. So let's talk a little bit about how one would use the document. Based upon the thesis that I would have introduced, probably my last main body paragraph would be talking about those compromises that were attempted but didn't work. Popular sovereignty, right? So what would be a very obvious document, maybe even a pictorial document, that I could potentially use to show that compromise was attempted, political compromise was attempted, but clearly political compromise wasn't working.
Remember the last one, illustration, 1956?
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you guys remember who's getting beaten? Yeah, his name is Sumner. His name is Charles Sumner. Here is a depiction. And by the way, what is being suggested here in this depiction? Is this being straightforward or is this being sarcastic? Southern chivalry, argument versus club. You get it? Like, what's chivalry supposed to be? You guys know what chivalry means? Yeah. So Southern honor and respect. Look at the Southerner beating the Northerner. You guys see that? And do you remember what this was in response to?
Made fun of his relatives who had described him as like he talked weird.
Yes, he did. Does anyone remember what the title of his speech was? What was he really ranting about? Yeah, he's making fun of these people. Yeah, that's right. The name of his speech was The Crime Against Kansas. So if I'm talking about the failure of compromise, I'm talking about the failure of popular sovereignty, this is a perfect document in order for me to use to show that North and South are, they've tried compromising. Popular sovereignty was like the last ditch compromise. Kansas tries to come in, and not only is there bleeding in Kansas, but there's bleeding where? Yeah, on the Senate floor. And so if you were to use, so now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you go about using and citing the document in the body paragraph. You could describe the document. That's probably the best thing to do. Try not to, even if there's like lots of words, try not to spend much time quoting documents. That won't get you much. If you want to quote a phrase out of a document, 4 words, 5 words, that's okay. But try to interpret the document. Try to describe the document. And then after you're done describing the document, so supposing you are interpreting or describing, let's say Doc D, here's Senator Webster talking. You're describing that, and so you would say here in this Senate speech, here he's talking about the North basically not being nice enough to the South. He's trying to strike a conciliar tone with the Southerners. And so you might summarize that even a Northern senator like Daniel Webster continued in the spirit of compromise, for according to the speech that he gave, this is what you say in your paper, on March 7th, 1850, Daniel Webster said, And you can either do a short quote or do a summary of what he said. You write it down. And then the way to do a quote, you would put the quote in front of the citation. So this is Doc D. It needs to look like that. So this is true if you type it or if you write it out. So describe the document or quote. Then you would say bracket document D. And just to let you know, they aren't using the alphabet anymore. So when you go in for the AP exam in May, you will not see, you know, A or C or whatever. It'll be 1 or 3 or 7, right? So, but you say doc B, bracket, bracket, period goes on this side. What you don't do is say, according to document A, blah, 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 blah. No, no, no. Describe who said it. Why is it relevant? That's right. Describe the document, who writes it, why is it important, and then you cite it in this fashion. And so in the case of the picture, you would probably describe the picture. You would say, oh, let's see here really quickly. An illustration by J.L. Maggie of the beating of Charles Sumner on the Senate floor. See, now you're describing the document. Mocks the idea of Southern chivalry. Brackets, Doc E, period. And then you go on to explain how that proves or helps prove your argument. You see how that kind of works? So, over the weekend, please, in addition to the other homework that I've given you, which is maybe too much, I don't know. Let me know if it's too much. Because you're supposed to kind of watch about half an hour of video, maybe 40 minutes of the video. You're supposed to read the chapter, and now I'm having you write a paragraph. Okay?
The video is not the video in the website. They're like
yeah, there's another video that's Ken Burns' documentary that I assigned. It's in a separate assignment. So basically, I'm supplementing some in-class teaching time with these other videos. Yeah. Let me know if that's too much for you. I guess when it comes down to it, the most important thing for class on Tuesday would be the chapter. If you need to put out the video, that would be, I guess, the least important thing to put out the video. The video does help you, though, with this DBQ. But do please try to also have your first paragraph done. Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you guys at home. If there are any questions, stay on. If there are any questions, I'll answer any questions. Otherwise, you're moving on to state period.
Wait, last time didn't cover?
Uh-huh.
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
But I read from chapter 16.
Oh.
I didn't do very good on the quiz. Thank you.
Okay. You want to take chapter 16? You want to take chapter 16 since you're ready for it?
Sure, not right now, but yeah, that works with me.
Okay. You want to do that?
I'm just talking the 15 did good.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah.
That's okay. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Take one of those.
Forgot about those. All right, see you.
See you. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mr. Cook.
We'll see you guys.